So without further ado, I want to bring on our guest, Dan Cohen. Dan, I hope you're doing well. And I have a question for you that just came to my desk from the IDF spokesperson who said the ratio of killing 2 civilians in Gaza for every armed member of Hamas is considered highly positive and actually is perhaps unique in the world. Now, I don't contest that it's unique, but how is that positive, and how does a statement like that not immediately end him up in some sort of international criminal tribunal?
Well, I mean, I don't know exactly what the laws of proportionality are, but it sounds like a flat out lie from the IDF spokesperson, which would be about the least surprising thing I've, heard all week. I mean, the first major strike on Jabalia refugee camp, where they killed roughly 300 people. They wiped out an entire neighborhood block in this refugee camp. The Israelis went on CNN, the Israeli military spokesperson, and said that they killed 1 Hamas terrorist in this strike. So they justified it by saying, well, there was 1 person among those 300. And now they're saying, oh, it's 2 to 1. We're killing 2 civilians for every 1 so-called terrorist. So it just sounds like it's completely made up. And of course, CNN corporate media is never going to ask them any tough questions, never going to force them to admit that that's a total lie.
It is a total lie, but hypothetically, I'd imagine if Putin said something like that about, Ukrainian civilians, I'd imagine that there would be immediately, war crimes charges brought up against him by every Western state because of the level of civilian, casualties he's bringing about in Ukraine. So even with that, official lie that Israel's putting out, that in it of itself is absurd and insane to me. Another really interesting point that I heard brought up this week by the Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, he said that a tactical victory for Israel inside of Gaza is a strategic defeat because Israel is, in effect, driving civilians into the arms of Hamas. What do you make of that? And what can you decipher, if any? I know we've talked about this, the goals of the Israeli military in this operation in Gaza.
Well, since the very beginning, Benjamin Netanyahu listed out 2 totally contradictory goals, one of them being the defeat of Hamas, and the second being the safe return of the captives in Gaza. But in order to defeat Hamas, they basically have to commit genocide and reduce every building to rubble with people inside. And that's what they're trying to do to this point. Now, they're not going to be able to do it because of geopolitical considerations. The U.S., is telling them you're going to have to wrap this up in, a few weeks or a month or whatever it is. So they can't fundamentally do that. But in bombing so heavily, they are killing their own people. I mean, we just saw testimony from a family member of one of the captives in Gaza who said that at least 3 people were killed. 3 captives were killed by Israeli bombing. And some of the Israeli captives who have come out have said that the scariest thing was not that they'd be executed by Hamas, but that they would be bombed by their own military. So these 2 goals are totally contradictory. And I think the real agenda is just to kill as many people as possible, including hostages, to prevent any kind of negotiations where Hamas could extract concessions from Israel. But in terms of, the United States knows Lloyd Austin and the kind of, the deep state, the establishment here in Washington, D.C., they know that Israel's not going to fundamentally be able to defeat Hamas. So they're just going to let them go wild and just bomb like maniacs because it'll enrich the coffers of the military-industrial complex for as long as is politically possible. But I mean, even early on in this war on Gaza, the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of the most neocon think tanks, was already saying not long after October 7th, what if Israel loses this war? So, I mean, that's what Lloyd Austin is mentioning too now. So there are whispers. There was a piece in The Guardian. The establishment knows that Israel's not going to be able to achieve its stated goals here. So, I mean, it's just a matter of time until Israel loses, in the sense that it has all of the military power in the world and it cannot defeat this plucky armed resistance group.
Yeah, it always seemed ludicrous that that'd be the official goal for the Israeli military, considering it's really a non-starter. And it seems as though the political elite in the United States and in the West are using what's going on as an opportunity to cancel and silence any government dissidents, even those that are, maybe mildly critical of the government and are wary about this genocide that's taking place. This week, United States Congress passed a resolution equating anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. And of course, it was passed by a bunch of Zionists in the United States House of Representatives. What do you make of that statement coming from our own government that Zionism is somehow equivalent of anti-Zionism, somehow equivalent of being anti-Semitic?
Well, first of all, it just shows the incredible power that the Israel lobby has in Congress, which, if as Congress just did, equates Judaism with Zionism. Well, that's just what they're saying is it reinforces an anti-Semitic trope of Jewish control. So it's kind of ironic, but if you actually just break this down logically, if we say anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, then that means Zionism, inversely, is Judaism. So if Zionism is Judaism, well, who believes that? Zionists, of course, and Nazis. That means that all Jews, myself, the religious Jews of the thousands of Satmar Jews who live in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, who oppose the state of Israel on theological grounds. They oppose Zionism. They're all anti-Semites, or they're all not real Americans, is what it means. It means they are all the only way that you can be a Jew, according to the U.S. Congress, is to be loyal to a foreign country, loyal to Israel, that is my real country. And it's not my country at all. I have nothing to do with it. And those Jews completely reject it because of principled, actual, real Jewish beliefs. So what that statement, that resolution is an affirmation of anti-Semitism. It is anti-Semitic itself because it says that the only way you can be Jew is to be loyal to some other country, and therefore you are a fifth column. I, as a Jew, am a fifth column in this country. That's straight up anti-Semitism. So it's really troubling. I mean, I'm not worried that, I'm going to be like, it doesn't have any legal teeth. It's just a stupid resolution. Mm-hmm. But you think about the climate of McCarthyism in universities right now. It's going to be used to crack down on students who are protesting to end the genocide of Gaza, and in the professional realm, where after how many years where people are forced to say, oh, we accept diversity and LGBTQIA2S plus, you have to go along with that and show the correct position. The work was politicized, the workplace was politicized. Suddenly, if you want to express your political opinion that you oppose genocide, suddenly you're an anti-Semite and you have to be fired. That's what this is really about, is cracking down on free speech and doing away with all dissent.
Mm-hmm. Shifting gears back to the daily life, I guess, of average Gazans right now. You've been to Gaza, and there was a viewer who emailed in a few moments ago during our previous segment, and they asked the question, Jackson, what happens to the children who've lost their entire families in the bombings? Are there organizations that are able to essentially foster these children, these orphans? I mean, and I thought about it. I asked the question myself. I've never really considered that. It seems like most of the videos I see today from Gaza, the life there is about focus on getting food, water, electricity, and making sure that they save as many people from these bombings as possible. So what can you speak to the life of Gaza? And I know you are in constant contact with people there, about what it's like to live in this open air prison in the midst of this unprecedented bombing.
Well, I mean, it's just beyond anything that you or I can imagine. I mean, I've been in Gaza under bombing. I've seen 14-story towers taken out by American supplied bunker busters in what an Israeli general compared to 9/11, saying that this was like 9/11 for Gaza. You know, comparing the Israeli military favorably to Al Qaeda. I actually watched them say that, but I mean that was in 2014. What's happening now is just a complete different scale than anything we can imagine. I don't even have words for the level of just horror that Palestinians in Gaza are suffering through on a daily basis. Constant bombing, day and night, maximum a couple of hours of sleep. And then at any point you can just be exterminated, you and your entire family, with the flip of a switch. And, you know, they have the unfortunate choice of basically dispersing into different homes or different parts of the home, hoping that maybe someone will survive if they get bombed, or maybe you can all stay together. So then you know, when you have your last moments together, that's the choice Palestinians are being given in Gaza. And many of them just choose to stay together because nowhere is safe. So you might as well be together and die with your family instead of being alone. In terms of the orphan children, which of which there are many, I mean, inside Gaza's hospitals, which are, you know, most of them are not functional anymore at all. There was a term, it was like no remaining injured, no remaining family members of babies and small children whose entire families have been exterminated. And there is no social support for these kids who are, maimed and barely survived. They have no family that's going to take them. So how is Gaza supposed to deal with that? It's just the most horrifying, criminal, shocking actions possible, and there has to be accountability. If there's any kind of civilization in this world, Netanyahu and his band of war criminals and Biden and all of the enablers here in Washington should be on trial for genocide.
I agree with that. And, you know, it seems as though whatever goals Israel had in this operation, they're beginning to already recognize, at least the rank and file are beginning to recognize, that it's completely unachievable. There was a report from Al Jazeera, which we have yet to, I guess, get 100% confirmation on, but they said that up to 70% of Israeli troops in the north of Gaza may in fact begin to be facing a potential withdrawal from the north of Gaza because of the level of Hamas and resistance airstrikes on their positions there. Can you comment on that and, share what you may have heard about the situation for those troops in the north of Gaza?
I mean, it's hard to know what exactly the reality on the ground is, but, you know, the Israelis, like if you read Israeli media, the front headlines are always, encircling Khan Yunis. It's always about the incredible success the Israeli military has. It's just total propaganda. But then we see these videos that Hamas and Al-Qassam, its armed wing, are releasing of their fighters basically smoking Israeli soldiers and Israeli tanks. And there are images that have come out of a graveyard of Israeli tanks and armored vehicles. So it's hard to know what exactly the casualties on the Israeli side really are, though they have, of course, every reason to hide those real numbers. And I mean, the most stunning video to me was the one that came out yesterday where a Qassam fighter popped out of some tunnel, just poked his head up with a camera, and you see Israeli soldiers walking around. So it suggests that the Israelis, I mean, look, they want to say they are in control. Hamas never tried to stop them from really fully coming into Gaza. That's not what a resistance movement does. It doesn't go for a full-on clash, military against military. It's death by 1,000 cuts. That is Al-Qassam's strategy. So, the Israelis can, blow up buildings and post videos of all these kinds of things and make themselves look strong and undefeatable to the outside world and to their own public. But I mean, the reality is they just simply cannot control Gaza, which has a very sophisticated armed resistance, multiple factions that all work together, and a very complex tunnel system that they just simply don't know what to do with. So, I mean, are they? I don't know that they're really thinking of withdrawal. It could be you know, I think as long as they can keep the secret of how many soldiers are actually getting killed, they'll want to stay in there. And I think this genocide will go on for a few weeks yet before they'll consider anything. But I mean, no doubt they're taking more casualties than they're admitting.
Of course. And one last question for you about Netanyahu, because as we all know, prior to this war breaking out, we saw that Netanyahu was facing a lot of criticism from within his own country, a lot of big protests, actually, even about how he was stacking this, this Supreme Court in Israel, and other concerns of corruption that stem, far further into the past for Netanyahu and his family. We're now witnessing something really odd take place. Netanyahu had a meeting with the families of hostages who are still inside of Gaza, and he told those families that he's not going to be able to free all of the hostages, and that caused an uproar at the meeting. Also, we saw that a family, one of the families of these hostages who's actually been freed and back in Israel, they refused to meet with Netanyahu upon their return. So what does this speak to Netanyahu's political future in Israel? Is it limited? Do you think it's going to last for the remainder of this war? And what's the sentiment like for average Israelis on the ground towards their government?
Well, back in the summer, when the protests against Netanyahu and his judicial coup, which basically sought to do away with the last kind of facades of Israel's so-called democracy, getting rid of the Supreme Court, essentially, the protests were so severe that internally people thought the state might collapse. According to the Times of Israel, 30% of Israelis were considering leaving the country altogether. So now that, since there's a war, that has been temporarily papered over. There's because of wartime unity. But I mean, there's no doubt that once that ceasefire comes, it's going to be, Netanyahu's head is next on the chopping block. The public is going to come after him. I mean, he is seen as a centrist in Israel. Everyone thinks he's far right. And, sure, he is. He's a fascist. But on the Israeli political spectrum, he is the hollow center. The real right wing is who put him into power in order to protect his political career. And so once they don't need him anymore and they smell weakness, they'll do away with him, and Netanyahu will basically be finished. I mean, he's the longest serving prime minister in Israeli history, and I think he's basically done for. This is his last hurrah, and we see that the United States is basically looking to get rid of Netanyahu too. That's been clear for a couple of months because the asset has become a liability. And so even during those protests, you actually saw the U.S. hand inside in those. The former prime minister, Ehud Barak, confirmed that they were basically using color revolution style tactics to oust Netanyahu because they need someone who can maintain the facade, the mirage, the lie of Israeli democracy. And Netanyahu's just too dirty now. So they want to bring in someone kind of weaker, more pliable, like Yair Lapid from Yesh Atid, who's the opposition, or someone like Benny Gantz, the former defense minister, who, those guys are just totally weak and will do more or less whatever the U.S. tells them.
Mm-hmm. Well, as much as I can't wait for the day in which Netanyahu's out, I think for the rest of the world, and especially for Palestinians, it's probably going to be much worse to have a happy liberal face on the cover of genocide that's taking place, and the world will probably look the other way once that takes place, unfortunately. So anyways, Dan Cohen, thank you so much for joining us. And everyone, be sure to follow Dan. On Twitter, you can follow him at Dan Cohen. He also does great reporting at Uncaptured News. It's new that you launched Uncaptured News, right?
Yeah, it's really just since October 7th that I've decided to just put all my effort into it full time. So I think it's Uncaptured News on Twitter, and I'm Dan Cohen 3000 on Twitter. So check me out there.
Great. Awesome. Dan, thank you so much for joining us here on the Mother of All Talk Shows. Again, greatly appreciate your expertise.